Welcome to our webinar, Most Favored Nation, US Implementation and European Implications. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. All participants are muted, yes, apart from the panelists. You can send your questions, because I'm sure you are going to have many questions, at any time through the chat, okay? And during the last half an hour, we are going to address them as many as we can. This session is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording. The structure of the webinar includes a 1-hour presentation followed by a roundtable of half an hour where we will answer your questions. Lastly, I would like to introduce the organizer of today's webinar, that is Alira Health. Alira Health is a global consulting firm. We are in Europe and in the US, and we provide integrated consulting services across regulatory, market access, and commercial strategy. We are also a full CRO. That said, I'm delighted to introduce the speakers of today. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I can. Do you all see my screen? I hope so. I hope that you see my screen. Yes, and today we have with us Deborah Williams, founder of Health Policy Insight. Deborah has a lot of experience as health policy analyst on Capitol Hill and in the private sector. One moment, I lost my screen for some reason. Sorry about that. I cannot see the screen. Okay, sorry, stop. Share my screen, and I cannot see it. Sorry to everyone. I don't know where it is. Here. Okay, good. So she's recognized for her expertise in Medicare, Medicaid, and she has a lot of experience in the federal health regulatory issues. We also have with us Anna Kaltenboeck. Anna is the president of Verdant Research. She, before founding Verdant, she was an advisor on the Senate Committee on Finance, where she worked in issues including Medicare negotiation. Both of them are going to explain how MFN works in the US. We also have with us Philippe Monteyne, medical doctor and PhD. Dr. Philippe is an expert in R&D, and he has worked in the pharmaceutical industry for many, many years. And he's also, at the moment, an investor and pharmaceutical professional, and he works in Verdant Capital and private equity. And he's going to speak about the effects and impacts on innovation of MFN. Finally, I'm Nerea Blanqué, partner at Alira and expert in market access, pricing, and sustainability. And that's why I'm going to speak on the pricing effects of MFN. Today, 5 minutes of opening that we're almost finishing. After that, Anna is going to speak for 15 minutes of the current state and how we arrived here on US pricing policy and MFN basics. After that, Deborah is going to go in depth into the 3 US models of MFN. After that, Anna will explain to us a little bit for 5 minutes some product level pricing examples, because not everything is like it seems. Not all are price reductions. And after that, I will speak about the consequences for Europe, the pricing consequences, and Philippe about the impact on companies and innovation, followed by 30 minutes of roundtable and Q&A. So I leave the floor to Anna, that is going to speak about US pricing policy. Thank you, Anna. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nerea. Thank you for having me, and hi, everyone. So we have a lot to get through. I apologize if I'm going to talk quickly, but let's get started with where we are right now in the United States. Why are we sitting here? I think the starting point of that conversation is that the United States consistently has some of the highest drug prices in the world. And the reason we are even talking about MFN is that there has been consistent political pressure to address those prices. Then that political pressure hasn't necessarily resulted in something that has been satisfactory to customers or consumers and American taxpayers to date. So we are now in this situation where the Trump administration has taken matters into its own hands and really started to move forward with these types of models that can be implemented through what's known as demonstration authority, or use this sort of the executive branch as a way of moving forward without necessarily legislating or going directly through lengthy regulatory processes. And so I wanted to start there just to sort of say that this is, you know, an evolution that builds on existing US structures. And so we should really talk about what those structures mean in order to be able to interpret what all of this is going to do and how it might look for different types of drugs. So if we can go to the next slide. To understand the way the US works, we first have to understand the fact that it is a very fragmented healthcare system, full stop. It has a fragmented approach to payment. It also has a fragmented approach to coverage and reimbursement, broadly, including for drugs. And so, unlike other advanced economies, the US does not centralize or federalize negotiations for drugs. It uses a private market approach to that essentially puts individual plan sponsors, of which there are many, in the United States, in the role of negotiating with manufacturers of drugs directly. And so we've got, you know, a mix of public and private payers that do this. In the pricing process, therefore, there is no central benchmark that gets established that sort of creates a common reference point from which everyone makes their money in the supply chain. Instead, what we have is manufacturers setting list price. That becomes the reference point. And then below that are net price negotiations and additional markups, for example, in the supply chain on top of that. So we have, as a consequence of that, the system of very high list prices known as wholesale acquisition cost, or WAC, which are set by manufacturers. We have multiple net prices across different payers, which is economists know as price discrimination. We also have this dynamic where list prices grow over time, and net prices can also grow over time. So next page. The advancement slide is.
Yeah.
So part of this is also the fact that we don't regulate our supply chain and our payment processes in the way that you see in a lot of European and OECD countries. So again, WAC is set by manufacturers, but we also have very limited post-launch regulation. So we, instead of in other countries where there might be price caps associated with, you know, certain classes of drugs or individual drugs, or even mandatory price revisions that might lead to price decreases over the life cycle of a product on the market, or regulating supply chain markups, we take a different approach. So there is no explicit launch price regulation. There's very limited post-launch regulation. We can talk about that in a minute. And then there's really no strong supply chain regulation where we say, okay, you can't pay more than a certain amount above this, you know, price or markup, or you can't take more than a certain amount of discount from it. So all of this essentially allows for a system in which the net price dynamics and the markup dynamics contribute far more than they do, say, in Europe, where you still have net price concessions, but they aren't to the extremes that we see in the US. And so what we have is these annual or semi-annual price increases that determined by manufacturers. We have manufacturer-controlled rebates that offset some of these price increases back to individual payers, not all of them, some of them. And then we also have, in many instances, very high net prices for drugs where there's not a lot of competition and strong demand, right? Because they don't have to give rebates for those. And so if we go to the next slide. The results really speak for themselves. And I want to just, this slide is, see it as almost a random sample. It's not. But this is an example of something that I recently, an analysis my team did, where we looked at the second cohort of drugs to be negotiated in Medicare. This is a new program we can talk about in a moment, where Medicare has started to negotiate what it pays for certain products. And this is a sort of a one cohort, so it's one snapshot. These are 15 drugs that have been on the US market for a number of years, at least 7 years as of their date of their selection. And these are what you see on in these bars is the price change since their launch after adjusting for inflation. And what you can see is outside of the United States, almost universally, or rather universally, their prices go down over time after initial launch. And what you see on the right in the United States is this consistent price growth over time for the vast majority of these products, with the exception of a few where there's been some changes in dynamics in the therapeutic class or in you know, the manufacturer behavior that has resulted in a recent price change. And so we have this, you know, this proliferation of high prices at the start and then growth over time that really creates this pressure. Next slide. And the effect of that is really felt very keenly. So in healthcare spending, we spend far more per capita than other countries do. In general, we also spend, of course, more per capita on pharmaceutical products. You can see we spend nearly twice as much as, more than twice as much as OECD countries in terms of per capita pharmaceutical spending. As a proportion of our GDP, our health spending is greater, and our drug prices in many instances are, right now we're seeing 2.7 times, 2.8 times higher than comparable OECD countries. And so this is, the consequence of all of this is, of course, budget pressure and affordability pressure. If we go to the next slide. In order to understand how that plays out, you have to understand a little bit about the fragmentation that comes along with the US system. And so the best way to think about this is in these broad buckets, 3 types of payers. The first type of payer, we call them commercial payers. And this is insurance policies, including pharmacy benefits, that are provided through the private market. And the vast majority are through employer-based policies. So the employer pays for your insurance for an employee or for the family members of that employee. Otherwise, there are now individuals who also buy their insurance through the Affordable Care Act marketplaces. This is Obamacare. So this is for the population up until 65. Above the age of 65, we see, and those with long-term disabilities are eligible for Medicare, and that is federally funded an entitlement program in which individuals get coverage for inpatient, outpatient care, as well as prescription drugs. And then in addition to that, we also have what's known as Medicaid. Medicaid is designed for low-income individuals and low-income children. And so that's the bucket here on the bottom. And each of these things is funded a bit differently. It's also governed under different law and under different approaches. Although in many instances, as we'll see, those laws reference to each other in really important ways. Next slide. So I just want to emphasize here that this is an important point, which is that the differential policies also affect really different patient groups or individuals, right? So the vast majority of Americans, 55% or so, are enrolled in an employer-sponsored health plan. About 14% are in these sort of non-group, sort of like exchange plans. And then another 18% are on a Medicare Part D or MAPD, so Medicare Advantage, which is a bundled type of plan. And then another 20% are covered under Medicaid. So it actually is interesting because this makes Medicaid the largest sort of single payer. If you think about it from the federal perspective, there is federal funding that goes into Medicaid programs. However, Medicaid is operated at the state level, which means there's really 50 different states and then, of course, some territories that operate their own Medicaid programs and their own budgets. So this is important to remember when you think about that fragmentation across all of these plans. If you go to the next slide. As a result of all of that fragmentation, we know, okay, we have a high price challenge, we have affordability challenges, but it's experienced very differently by different types of patients and by the payers that support those individuals. And so on the Medicaid side, we have relatively low copays. We do so, however, have a lot of spending pressure because states have to balance their budgets at the end of every year, and states do hold a fair amount of the liability that is associated with Medicaid spending, and there's some federal support. But at the end of the day, when you look at a state budget, there's always 2 biggest line items: is Medicaid and it's education. And so these are really important drivers for states. And the states are between a rock and a hard place in many instances because by federal law, if a manufacturer signs up to participate in the Medicaid program, which requires them to give a certain level of discount or rebates to Medicaid, that does mean that the drugs must be covered. So that's the Medicaid challenge. On the Medicare side, this is a growing burden of an entitlement program, right? So we have growing premiums, growing individual out-of-pocket costs, because in many instances, especially up until the point before the IRA, which reformed some of this, you have a lot of individuals who had uncapped out-of-pocket costs, which meant that they had a lot of affordability issues if they were on these high-priced specialty drugs that are usually covered under co-insurance. And so that brings me to the third bucket, which is private payers. And that's where we see, that 55% of the population, 60% of the population that really sits within that bucket faces high out-of-pocket costs because they have usually high deductible health plans, so a large deductible in which they really pay the full price of the drug that's set by the manufacturer, or their co-pays and co-insurance, even during the benefits phase, are driven by still the high prices, right? Those do ultimately end up influencing what co-pay levels are. And the way in which private insurers manage some of this is access restrictions, right? So making sure that you restrict how many people can access, or the types of patients who access certain products. So each of these groups feels this in a slightly different way, but the fundamental pressure remains the same. Keep going. The solution to this depends then on the individual groups, right? So everyone has had to respond. So in Medicaid, the response, if you can just click the animation, has been what we know as best price rebates and inflation rebates. Those are two things. The best price guarantees that that the Medicaid programs get the best price offered to any commercial payer in the United States. Inflation rebates simply mean that they get back any money that's spent in excess of inflation over time on the drugs that they use. So note, best price is an MFN policy. It is a reference point, right? It's a reference price policy. Then we have, click again, Medicare. Here we've sort of had a system where we incorporate provider discounts and so forth into physician reimbursement for products. That has, it's not a core point of our conversation today, but mixed effect. The IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, probably had the biggest recent reforms to address some of these things. That means we now have Medicare negotiation for some older drugs being used in being dispensed through pharmacies or administered by physicians. We also now have inflation rebates for those products. We also have redesigned the Part D benefit and introduced copay caps to try to discourage some of the inflation, and also to encourage people to use their drugs when, at high price, when they are high priced, because they've previously been rationing them because they've had capped out-of-pocket cost. And on the employer side, so on the commercial payer side, this gets interesting because there's no one policy solution here. And so the private market has largely responded here instead. So we see manufacturer copay coupons, which are designed to give people access to the drugs in hopes that they will eventually spend enough on their healthcare benefit to qualify the health benefits phase to kick in and for the health plan to cover that drug. And then for a lot of these health plans, what they've introduced are these inflation protection clauses, which means that the plan sponsor gets back some of the price growth in excess of inflation. So those are sort of the solutions in place, which could tell you something about, the one thing we haven't done here is that sort of centralized negotiation framework across different payers, right? That's not something we've done yet. Done it to a small extent in Part D and Part B, but not yet, in a broader way. So next slide. That takes us to MFN, and I want to make sure to give Deborah as much time as possible. So just a quick overview. MFN, again, it's a reference price scheme. So it is really about pointing to some other entity that gets a better price and says, I want that price. You have to guarantee me that price. We already do that in Medicaid with best price. Now the proposal is to go further and to say outside of the United States, we would like to get a better price for drugs that references to ex-US prices. So the idea of international MFN is not foreign. It's featured prominently in Trump 1 before the second Trump administration now. I won't go into too many details. Those did not take off initially. I think we are in a different sort of phase now with the type of rulemaking that he's proposed here. In addition, note that the Inflation Reduction Act in its current form is built on the chassis of HR 3, which did actually include international reference pricing and a broader negotiation framework that would have included that commercial health plan sector. So just reminder that these are, concepts that have been thrown around in the US context for quite some time. Going. So the way that Trump thinks about this is really important because the president, even though Republicans have been long sort of industry favored, sort of industry disposed, I think, more so than Democrats, is that this is an incredibly populist issue, and he is a populist president. So he has responded very much to the positive polling that corresponds to reducing pharmaceutical costs in the United States. It ties to economic nationalism in the way that, is a very strong part of his platform. And it's also populist and anti-corporatist in its sentiment, even if not in its execution. And I think that's important to remember. So this has had a bipartisan appeal, but I think he has taken a different spin on it, and sort of colored outside of the boxes of how you would traditionally approach this, with still working, ironically, within that same system of boxes. So next page. So there are sort of several different models that have now been introduced. I'm going to quickly cover them, the names and so forth. So the first one is Generous in Medicaid. So this is an MFN program for Medicaid specifically. Then we have Globe and Guard in Medicare. Globe is for drugs in Part B. Those are drugs administered by physicians. Guard is for Part D, pharmacy dispensed drugs. And then for the commercial market, what he's introduced is sort of this notion of a direct-to-consumer platform that does not tie into payer coverage. However, then that's sort of the solution in that part of the patchwork quilt. So, okay. So just important to note what it does not do. It doesn't change. Like I said, it colors outside of the lines of the boxes, but it still accepts the boxes as what they are. And so it doesn't change the fragmented nature of US pricing. It doesn't change the coverage sort of policies. It also doesn't, necessarily attach itself to launch prices. There's some question as to whether or not launch prices might get addressed through these sort of individual manufacturer contract that he's entered into with 16 manufacturers. And it doesn't really provide a solution for the commercial health plan that accounts for the bulk of health plan coverage. So I'm going to turn this now over to Deb. Sorry, I think we can probably skip the key takeaways and move straight to Deb. So we, all right.
Thank you, Anna. I'm going to go a little bit more in detail about Generous, Guard, and Globe. So let's go to my next slide. Let's set the context, because this might be the model that survives. It's unclear at this point. And that's, I'm calling it now the contract model. And that's wholly a name that I've made up. And essentially, what it is MFN net, whatever that means, for Medicaid, which is our low income, again, for all primarily outpatient drugs. It asks the manufacturers to provide MFN pricing, not clear if it's list or net, for newly launched drugs to Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial payers. And Albert Bourla recently clarified that this is only for the 8 countries, pointing out that, it's only 8 countries. Oh, too bad, Germany. And there are 100 left. And DTC, of course, we're not going to talk in detail about DTC, direct to consumer, which is out-of-pocket cost today, because it's just at its nascent stage. To date, 16 of the 17 companies who were asked, who are the largest companies in the world, have agreed. Let's go into key terms and concepts. The next slide, please. As Anna mentioned, that MFN is a shortcut for reference pricing. You have it in the EU. As Anna points out, we have it through best price. Where I might disagree with her is that best price is one of the ways that has pushed up pricing in the US. And by pushing up pricing in the US, the inflation rebates, which now you've got the MFN, best price has pushed things up, the inflation rebates have pushed things down. And that's why companies have agreed in these letters, because they're between a rock and a hard place. Okay, but MFN can be based on either list price or net prices. And remember, it's really, actually, to tell you the truth, it's not really lower prices. That's a misnomer. It's a lower cost to whatever the payer is that it targets. And just like in tariffs, manufacturers are limited to how they can recoup these MFN-based rebates. We'll talk about that at the end, because how can they respond to these models? Let's go on to the next one. So again, MFN is not so much of a price, it's a benchmark which creates a rebate or discount that is used to lower these specific payer costs. So we have an MFN list-like measure, which is based for both Guard and Globe, which is used in based on IQVIA data and the administration will calculate that. We have an MFN net, which is used in the GUARD and GLOBE demonstrations, and generous. And in the first two, at least, the administration has been extremely specific and said that if they go through with regulations, they'll have even more specificity on that. It's based upon the submitted aggregate sales and net sales and utilization by country. Now, there's been a lot of misnomer that they couldn't get the net prices, but here they've avoided them nicely by asking for your net sales data instead. What are going to be the rules? Again, there'll be more rules coming, but in general, a lot of the concepts in these rules and regulations are borrowed from US drug pricing. So we have a thing that's called reasonable assumptions, which means pretty much what it says, which is, are the assumptions you made in reporting this data, are they reasonable or not? On the MFN for net, for new products, that is so critical. I don't know if it's net or list. I assume that's in the contract those companies signed with the government. In GUARD and GLOBE, that is again with the retail pharmacy Medicare model, or GLOBE, the medical benefit Medicare model, manufacturers can choose list or net. So let's go into our next slide. So let's focus here. I have a lot of rules and regulations, and you can take a look at them. And, you know, let's focus on the benchmark. The benchmark for generous, for Medicaid, is the next to lowest net for 8 countries. So any country that's an outlier, say if South Korea had a very low price, that's excluded. In GUARD and GLOBE, they both have the same benchmark calculation, which is a manufacturer can choose method 1, which is the calculated list price based upon this publicly available data by IQVIA and others, or can use method 2, which it can report its own average aggregate net sales data. One thing I would like to say is the bottom point, these data are adjusted for purchasing power parity, which I like saying, purchasing power parity. And in the case of GUARD and GLOBE, also by exchange rates. One of the problems I see with this formula is that increases these benchmarks about 28%. The problem is it doesn't really make sense when you get to Switzerland, our country like that has very high GDP, because it's not like Switzerland, we're going to pay Switzerland rebates because they have high prices. So let's go into the next slide. It's kind of silly. Let's focus on the benchmark, so to speak. Oh, yes. And okay, the other thing we have to say is that the benchmark, we're going to apply the benchmark to the test population. The test population is only 25% of the areas in, for example, it's only 25% of the areas. So for GLOBE, for instance, that means it's half of Medicare Part B, because it doesn't include Medicare Advantage. And that's 25% of that. So we're already down to 25% of 50%, and you can figure that out. So it's a small part of the spending. We also, if I want to go to the first part of our cascade, they also exclude different claims. They exclude drugs. They exclude any drugs that are covered under the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, Medicare Fair Price, because they already have a government set price. They may exclude manufacturers that have made an MFN deal with the Trump administration. And I say may because the manufacturers say they have an exclusion, yet the regulations don't say that. All the regulations say is we may at some other time make amendments to these regulations through regulation or overlap with another demonstration or for other reasons. That's all they say. There's nothing specific like you signed onto this letter, so you're out. And this is important when we talk about the implications later on. Let's go to the next slide, and you can read what the exclusions are. Let's look at the GLOBE rebate formula because it's kind of fascinating. essentially we take our benchmark, and this is very simple. Take our benchmark, we're going to compare it to what's being paid now, which is the lower of the wholesale acquisition cost, or the average sales price for that drug in over any payer, and that would contain a rebate, or because we mentioned the inflation rebates, it's the increment, the difference between the globe rebate amount and the Medicare inflation rebate. And we talked about not only is this not a price, it's a rebate or discount, but it's also not in the supply chain. So theoretically, physicians won't be paid less because there's a rebate in this. This is a critical thing in the US and a critical concern of physicians. However, I would observe that the exclusion from best price only happens and it's tied to the inflation. Only 46 drugs pay an inflation rebate. So I don't kind of understand how that it holds together, but that's another issue. Let's go on to GARD formula for the rebate pharmacy, for the retail pharmacies. So we take our aggregate net price, so that's basically a pretty straightforward calculation. We take WAC sales, we subtract the negotiated rebates, the discounts and fees, and discounts from the manufactured drug program. In the appendix, I have listed the part of graph on the Part D program, so you can see what the mandated discounts are. We're basically just going to compare that to our international benchmark price, and there'll be a rebate. Let's go to the next slide. So essentially, what do they tell us in the regulations about what the impact is? Well, first of all, and this is, very interesting. In Globe, the list price is about, that is ASP, the list price, well, it's about 71% of the usual ASP. I think that's a typo. Anyway, the new price is about 71% of ASP. And it basically is about 54% of non-dual, non-340B drugs. So it's really a lot higher than I would have guessed, considering for the classes that are being used. Again, the classes that are used in this are also in the appendix. For GARD, what surprised me here is the average WAC of drugs that would be included in the demonstration is relatively low. It's about $47. It's very different than MFN because it's only the highest spending drugs, so the drug prices tend to be higher. And the MFN is about 49% lower than net price. So you're basically, no surprise, everyone knows that net price here being the list price minus rebates. No surprise that that's usually what people have found before. So let's go on to the next slide. So what I think of the big picture, first I want to say that the drug pricing rules in the United States are incredibly complicated. In the appendix, I have listed an interaction between drug pricing regulation and MFN. So if you're really interested in it, go look at that slide and spend some time puzzling it out. Essentially, as we all talked about, this is an extraction of U.S. pharmaceutical manufacturer profits for sales to public programs. Medicare is the largest single public payer, not the largest number of people, but the largest single number of payer because it has an older population who, by the way, use more drugs than the moms and kids in Medicaid or the commercial market. It's returned to the Medicare Trust Fund. It doesn't create any significant increases in I believe that looking at the drug pricing rules, that manufacturers, and if you believe manufacturers want to keep making the same amount of money that they did before, that the costs will mainly fall on the private sector, because for retail pharmacy, the main offset that they can do without paying back their price increases for list are reduction in private sector pharmacy rebates. Globe is more uncertain, and I won't go into that because it's very complicated. So will manufacturers raise their list prices in the US? it would be really stupid to offset a 25% loss within this demonstration with a 75% loss that you get by raising list prices. Call me stupid. Anyway, it's very difficult in general for companies to manage the response to this demonstration. It's based upon 25% of these very small areas that might have a couple thousand up to 100,000 people. It's dispersed throughout the United States. It's not attached to a particular provider or pharmacy. There's a very slow processing time for rebate. CMS thinks the demonstration is going to last. Processing time will take an extra 2 years after the end of the 5-year demonstration. Existing drug pricing regulations also make it more complicated for manufacturers. I can see why people and companies have said that what they would like to do is exclude countries, because that's frankly the easiest thing to do. Now, they could enable, of course, with this pricing fraud. In the case of Lilly, pretty good example. So let's, I think I have one more slide. And just to say, it's implementation certain. It's not clear. There's some, I believe there's litigation. Could be litigation with different large pharma companies who were offered the opportunity of the letter, as opposed to the mid and small size companies. And the second area of uncertainty is whether the litigation on mitigating the gaming track. Well, I would say on this, there's a particular provision. A lot of companies before these rules came out said, well, I'm just going to license my drugs in the EU to another country. Well, in Garden Globe, you'll still pay. So, and this also means it extends to the fact that if a company doesn't enter in the EU and a Chinese company creates the same molecule and patents it in China and then brings it into the EU, the US manufacturer could theoretically still pay a rebate based upon what other price that other company negotiates. So that's raised some eyebrows. This is probably why it's good not to tell people how you're going to cheat the system before the system actually exists. But let's go on.
Okay, so I'm going to show you just a few examples of how this might play out for different drugs that go through that chart that Deborah has shown, which is, so Brukinsa is one example here, which is exempted from negotiation. It is a small molecule oncology product that is used only in orphan indications, so it is now exempted under the rules from the OBBBA. We also have, so it's the manufacturer of Brukinsa is small. It is not one of the 16 companies that has a contract with the government. And so it does not qualify for generous instead, as we've sort of speculated that is likely what's, that those agreements include. It has about $800 million in Medicare Part D spending. And so all that makes it a candidate for the GUARD model. And so if you were to apply the GUARD methodology, here's some price points that you should consider. So the current WAC for an 80 milligram tab is $131.20 in the United States. If it were to be negotiated, it would be an offer ceiling would be set at about $86. And the price would somewhere fall below that. What you see here is the default, sort of the default model, or the method one approach for what it's called under Globe, which sort of we're showing here in this box is the spread between the highest and the lowest sort of price points in the 19 countries. So you see the highest price is $65, the lowest is about $36, the mean is somewhere in between, say about $48. So you see that, across the board, and this is after the purchasing power parity adjustment. So these, these are still below anything that's sort of under the offer ceiling. So the sort of irony here is that this product could, if it had been selected for negotiation, we probably, given what we know about the dynamics in the space, might have had a higher price. Here it's going to have, if the model proceeds, the price point is going to be more around $36. right? So this is how it looks in the GARD model. Next slide. Gamma GARD is another interesting one. This one is exempted from, Gamma GARD is an immunoglobulin, so it's a fractionated blood product, which is exempted from the IRA, or rather not IRA, it's exempted from negotiation under the IRA. It's possibly subject, though, to GLOBE because the manufacturer doesn't have an agreement with the administration again. So that's 74 million in Part B spending in 2023. And the way that this breaks down is, you know, a whack about $1,993, an offer ceiling of $696, simply because it's a very old product. So this offer ceiling there is quite low. But for this product, if it were to go into GLOBE, the maximum when you look at other countries is you know, not that much less than the United States, so 1,776, where the minimum is more around 641, which is where that price point would be set. So you can see again the, you know, relatively like differential contribution of these two policies. But what's also quite interesting is the spread here for pricing, which is just much more is higher and wider in other countries than you saw for Brukinsa, for example. So that really starts to matter. Next slide. So for Keytruda, needs no introduction, I think. Keytruda has delayed negotiation under the OBBA, so it didn't start to introduce normal sort of non-orphan indications until later in its lifespan. So it could be, although there is a manufacturer agreement in place. It could be in GLOBE, though, until that negotiated price applies. But instead, it's probably going to be under generous because of that manufacturer agreement. So we now see this one has 5.4 billion in Part B spending in 2023. So by far the largest of the three that we've looked at. The WAC for 25 milligram per ml dose is $6,000. The offer ceiling under the way that negotiation would work is about $3,936. Now, if you were to apply the generous model, which is a little bit different from the GLOBE and GARD model, it's a smaller number of countries that are in the reference bucket, which are generally have higher prices as well. And then you also see that it chooses the second lowest price. And so in the generous model, where you again see that very like wide variation between $5,765 and $1,881 within those 8 countries, it would be the $2,490 price benchmark that would be set. So it would still fall below the, you know, what the negotiated ceiling is. So it's actually an interesting dynamic where potentially a lower price could apply up to the point that a negotiated price does, which would be higher. So those are the sort of 3 different examples where you can kind of see the various contributions of the spread amongst the basket of countries, as well as the relative comparison to, you know, the alternative, which is essentially negotiation. So back to you guys.
Thanks a lot, Anna, Deborah. I hope that you have shed some light into our audience. Now it's my turn. I'm going to speak about the consequences for Europe and for the rest of the world of this MFN. Okay? As you know, there can be spillover effects. The US is going to look at prices in other countries. Yes, the manufacturer incentives are going to change, and the spillover effects can be done related to possible parallel trade towards the US or external reference pricing. I have a question for you. Let's see if I can show it to the audience, and you can vote very quickly. Yes, now that you understand MFN, how do you see the impact? Do you think that is going to be high, medium, or low? Yeah. We have high, mediums. I have a lot of answers. That means that I did it correctly. We are between high and medium. Yes. Okay, more or less you have all applied. You have all answered. And let's see if I can publish the answers. I close. We have 58% high and 36% medium. That I'm quite happy to see that the audience understands that the impact might not be as bad as many pharma companies think, okay? I share the results now because I want to carry on. 50% of you have answered, okay? That is around 50 people. Good. Now I close this, I hide it, and let's see if I can carry on with my conversation. Good. So now I carry on. Fantastic. Thank you. Now, next screen. So parallel trade. Parallel trade, it means that when there's a price gap between countries, there is an important incentive and then shortages and possible political tensions in the countries of origin. During the first executive orders on MFN, they explained if prices don't drop, we're going to source product from other countries. So it can have an effect on parallel trade. Second effect, external reference pricing. Yes, it behaves like a net. Prices all over the world, they behave like a net. They are all interconnected. One price change can have a global effect. ERP, external reference pricing, is not something new. It has been done globally for many, many years. However, there are slight differences on what we Europeans understand external reference pricing or the US external reference pricing. We normally always do it at net price level. And in US, we have this new net component. It is very confusing, but what we have seen is it's tied to sales, as Deborah has been explaining. Yes, therefore, it's not so, net prices are not so transparent. It's going to be aggregated. Yes, but this net thing creates a lot of uncertainty in the pharma community. Normally we do it, as you can see, I have put here on the left-hand side the example of Switzerland. Switzerland does external reference pricing in a more common way. Yes, they look at 9 countries at gross level, every 3 years, and the Swiss price might not exceed the average of the reference basket. So it's something easy to calculate, transparent, etc. The US, the globe, for example, in the right-hand side, looks at so many countries at as net sales with a complicated formula that we have seen with a rebel formula after launch or during launch. So really, this is what is creating the confusion. So to understand the real effect, we really need to understand the formula. And at the moment, it's not very clear. Here I have put an example because we say, okay, in generous, they look at 9 countries, but those countries look at other countries. So really, if we look at European level, any price in Europe will affect the prices in the countries referenced, yes, and therefore there is uncertainty of launch in Europe. It creates an uncertainty. If the price is not high enough, we will have some uncertain prices in the US. So the confusion, even it gets bigger. Where can we launch and how it can be calculated in these other countries. And it has a ripple effect in low and middle income countries. Some of them, here I have put some examples, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, some of them refer European countries that if they have a higher price, it will affect the access on this country, and therefore patients in poorer countries can also be affected by all these ripple effects, even if this was not the intention. Here I have put an example, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into details. But if there's a company A that at the moment has 50% approx of their sales in the US and the 50% in the rest of the world, they will have 2 options. Or they have 2 options. I drop my price in the US or I protect the US. Yes, and most of them are saying, what do we do? Do we just decrease the price, the US price drop, that as Anna said before, is half of my revenue, or do I protect US? And this is the confusion or what is translating into how are we going to see or how are we going to do our future launches. Therefore, the pharma industry has the pressure to raise EU net prices. How can you do that? reducing confidential rebates, increasing management entry agreements to protect exposure, or also selecting the countries they are going to launch in. Because of course, any country can have an impact in other European countries. How I see the worst case scenario, what is the worst that can happen? Patients will be the most affected by launch delays. So the patients, many patients in many countries, European countries, maybe they don't get new medication that in some illnesses can be super interesting to have. There's going to be uneven access across Europe and delays because maybe they don't, Europe doesn't receive a product on the first year of launch, maybe after 5 or 8 years. Therefore, no innovation is going to arrive to many countries and patients that they really need it. Also, licensing deals in Europe can be under the microscope. As Deborah said, it's going to be, the external reference pricing will be at product level, not at company. Yes, so it can have some spillover effects in US revenues. Main key takeaways. I believe that the risk can be contained if we understand that we think external reference pricing in different way. We need to really calculate with the formulas and see it as revenue, not as price level effect. Okay, and in this case, I think that the impact, there will be an impact, but not as big as we think. The main issue that I see in media tissue is the net price visibility. How is this going to work? Again, related to the new calculations and how they are done. We need clarification on that. And also take into account, there is a spillover, but we also need to think about health equity, and not only about European patients, but patients all over the world. Final recommendations, what can EU policymakers do if they are here listening? So maybe protect supply in case of parallel exports. This is the first thing. If we have product in here, let's ensure that it stays in the patients in here by different policy making. Reduce the anchoring vulnerability. Let's do management entry agreements, confidential tools, and global coordination across Europe. How are we going to do that? Give us some visibility. And also, always keeping in mind, as I said before, country equity, so cross-country equity. We have patients at the end of the day, we are pharma companies, we work in health, every single client deserves or patient deserves our drugs. Okay, I now leave the floor to my colleague, Philippe. So Philippe.
Thank you, Nerea. Do you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So yes, indeed, thank you everybody for staying with us during this presentation. I think we better understand many things now about this MFN policy, and I want to take a step back and talk a little bit very rapidly in a few minutes about the price for innovation. And everybody knows that in many cases the science starts in a very small scale between two founders, sometimes a scientific founders, a business founder, and then they create, it can be out of the university as a spin-out or other forms of small companies that are being created and are progressively grow with some funds from family, friends, then seed, and finally the VCs, and that's the world when I'm operating now. VCs are funding these companies at different series, A, B, C, whatever. And at some point, a biotech company can be taken over by a large pharmaceutical company or can go for an IPO, become autonomous and continue to grow as a pharmaceutical company itself. And that was my previous life, actually, before operating since 11 years now as an investor in biotechs. I've been working with 2 large pharmaceutical companies. If I can have the next slide. What is very important to know when we consider the price for innovation is also the attrition. This is an old slide, and unfortunately, it hasn't changed over time. For many years now, the probability of success is what it is. What you see here, you need about 30 assets, 30 projects at the preclinical stage to have one that succeeds to go to the market. And indeed, if you go from one step to the other, you will see preclinical to phase 1, 64% chances to succeed, phase 1 to phase 2, 44, and so on. And if you multiply these numbers, at the end, you have only 3% chances to go from preclinical to the market. If you are a large pharmaceutical company, you will have much more than 30 projects in preclinical stage. So you multiply to have more chances to go to the end. If you're a biotech company, you don't have so many projects, but you try to be smarter. And by definition, biotechs are more agile, more flexible, and can be a good source of innovation. Next slide. Because indeed, the issue we have observed for many years and even decades now is a progressive reduction and loss of productivity in R&D. This is a slide that shows the curve from 1950, from the 50s until the 2010s. And what you see is that the number of new medical entities that go to the market per $1 billion spent is decreasing over time. The investment in R&D has outpaced the sales growth, and yet it doesn't translate in a better efficiency, and certainly not in an increase in output in number of medicines. Now, it is also correct that all the easy drugs to develop, probably, or most of the easy drugs to develop have probably been developed, i.e. the symptomatic drugs. Now, if we go upstream in the cascade of a mode of action, you want to be disease modifying, you want to adapt to some subpopulation, it is becoming more complex. So there is a reason for that, but yet it's a major issue. Next slide, please. And that's why I believe that what I've observed myself and everybody else observed since 10, 15 years now, all the big pharmas are moving towards a trend to externalize their R&D. And that's what you see here. If you look at the top 20 largest pharmaceutical companies, and you see, you look at the origin of their FDA-approved drugs, you see that these days, 2/3 of their drugs are coming from external. What we mean external, it's mainly biotech companies. So smaller entities, again, more flexible, more agile. And only 1/3 is internal. It is definitely the case for biologics. It's also definitely the case, even more so when you come to new technologies, where gene therapy, cell therapy, whatever. The only exception are still the chemicals, the classical small molecules, because there the large pharmaceutical companies still have some competences. But for what I'm strongly believe that the big pharma companies are better developers than inventors. So they definitely are better in development, clinical development, regulatory, medical affairs, launch, rather than early stage of discovery and even early stage of preclinical and early clinical. Next slide. So how does that translate in terms of pay for innovation? The problem is what I try to describe just with these few slides, which are probably not known to you, or concepts that are probably well known to the audience. So it is a long journey to develop any drug, vaccine, or whatever modality. There is a whole cascade from the universities, spin-offs, biotechs, pharma companies, a huge attrition. And at the end, given all that attrition, in particular, the total development cost for a finally successful drug on the market is about $2 billion. There was a time we were talking about 1 billion for a long time, but we are more now close to 2 billion than 1 billion. And that's because of the attrition. So that's the cost to have one product on the market. It takes into account all the failures around for a large pharmaceutical company. And what is very, very important, we said it already before, and in particular, Nerea said it as well, the drugs must be available and affordable to those who need them. What are the solutions from a biotech and pharma perspective? The first thing is to try by all means to optimize the R&D spending. How do we do that? As I said, you can externalize to academia, to biotechs. You can be smarter in investment, and that's where the investors have an important role to play. And more and more new tools like artificial intelligence support drug discovery in a more efficient way. Robust health economics are needed to demonstrate the value of the innovation, and I'm also a big fan of involving patients' associations and consult the patients on the innovation and on the added value of the innovation. a differential pricing strategy where it is applicable, and process simplification. I don't need to come back on that. Next slide. Very rapidly, I'm myself a VC investor. I've already worked for a couple of funds now, and which are impact investing actually. And we try to combine the social return that you have also in venture philanthropy, but with the financial return that you have with a traditional investing. And in Europe, while classical European VCs focus on Europe essentially, but not only. And in my case, we focus on more than half of the investment in biotech, the rest in medtech. Next slide. Now, what is the MFN situation, taking into account all of that? Well, the present situation is that the US pricing is the cornerstone of global pharmaceutical innovation. The US generates 40 to 50% of global pharma profits, and the US revenues actually fund the global R&D and enable also indirectly lower pricing in other countries, including middle-income countries. So the biotech valuation and investor fundings rely a lot on the US revenues, and biotech strategically actually focus on developing drugs for the US market and focus on FDA approval. That's the current situation. We can debate about the pros and cons of that situation, but it is the situation today. And therefore, the global launch and the pricing strategy depend on price differentiation with high price markets, including US or part of the US, paying for low price markets in many cases. Next slide, and this is my last slide, is what are the risks then associated with this new MFN strategy? And it's a lot of perception at this stage. I'm happy that the survey that Nerea showed shows that we can already put in perspective, and the things are maybe not as bad as described even on this slide, because it will require a lot of education. But the risks in terms of perception is the reduced expected returns, and therefore lower biotech investment, delayed or avoided launches. That would be terrible. Delays or avoided launches in low price countries. Why? Just to avoid the pressure coming from low price countries on the US. Reduced or unequal access to innovation, or shift in R&D towards lower risk projects, higher return projects. So that would reduce finally the innovation, and ultimately a risk of long-term slowdown in biotech formation. So we believe, I think all of us, and we'll now go to the roundtable, that there is certainly a lot of education because of these perceptions. Some are true, some are maybe exaggerated. I propose, Nerea, that we now go to the roundtable to discuss a bit further.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to try to stop my screen. Let's see if I can do it. I don't share my screen anymore. Can you see my screen or not?
No, it's gone. It's good.
It's gone? Ah, fantastic. So
Yeah.
I cannot see you. I would like to see you, but anyway. Okay, so you don't see my screen. And now we're going to the questions of the audience. Okay, let's see. Right, we have many questions, to be honest, many questions. Now, let's go for the first one. There is noise in the, okay, there's someone that says that. Okay, will the impact of GLOBE on pricing, and how will this impact buy and bill practices, especially in oncology and community practice?
Let me take that here, if you don't mind. To clarify what I said earlier, according to the CMS model as proposed, the benchmark is about 71%. The adjusted benchmark is about 71% of ASP. However, it's a rebate. It's not a price. This is why I'm concerned about the potential for any best price impact now or in the future. Because if they did that, it would in fact be a price, it would be in the supply chain, and it would affect buy and bill. So right now, as proposed, nothing. Will it stay that way? There's potential for it not. I posted on this several times on LinkedIn, and you're happy to look at my thoughts and agree or disagree on it.
Another question, how will GUARD impact PBMs with the crash back to net pricing?
My theory, and Anna can comment on that too, is essentially fees are subtracted from the benchmark rebate. So there's sort of an incentive to pay more in fees that aren't bona fide service fees. So it's a little odd, but there's all this pressure on PBMs to do only bona fide service fees, that is fees for service. So I'd have to say, you know, there's this sort of a tension between what's going on. If you're really into this kind of stuff, there's a tension between what's really going on how they want PBMs to do fees and this formula. But theoretically, if I, as a company, am making more money, I'm paying less in fees, for goodness sakes, right? Goes to say.
Anna, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember that, you know, these models, to my read, don't fundamentally change the mechanics of who pays whom, right? So that still remains the same. It's happening on the back end where the rebates are. So I think to Deborah's point, it's that, you know, it's the spillover effects into other price points that could potentially alter it, or other sort of accounting mechanisms. It's also, we are in a weird moment with Part D, because we've just passed a law that alters how they can be compensated. So there's also this like move towards bona fide service fees, which I think within Part D, I'm actually not confident that we weren't already sort of passing everything through to the plan sponsor. And that this is sort of the PBM incentive there is just not what it looks like in the commercial market. So I think it's going to leave things relatively similar, is my hunch, but we have to see how all these different policy changes play out, because it's not the only one happening.
Okay, thank you, Anna. So another question for you. Could this all fall apart if the US Supreme Court rules against the Trump administration regarding
Well, actually, no, because they are I'm sorry. I wrote a paper on tariffs, which you can find at the American Enterprise Institute. But there are these 232 tariffs, although they're temporary. So no, I don't think so. And plus, you're left with a president that's incredibly powerful. And the third reason is, I think there's some benefit. People can disagree with me about getting the contract deal in legislation to protect against best price effects and affecting the supply chain price. But that's me.
Anna, do you have any comments on that?
No, I think I'm broadly aligned. I also think, you know, they've obviously voided tariffs for the companies that have participated in these deals. So like they have a 3-year exemption to the extent that they're going to apply. I also highly recommend Marta Wozinska's work on tariffs at Brookings, because it really explains this topic very well and how it applies differently for brand products as opposed to generic products. And we've been talking mostly about brands. So I think the dynamics here are, again, more nuanced. And I don't think, though, that the manufacturers would back away if the threat of tariffs sort of shifted, given everything that we've seen coming out of the administration so far. I think there's actually some real advantages to them to working with the administration that maybe some of these smaller biotech companies or companies that rely on like 1 or 2 products don't get access to.
You know, to make it clear is, of course, if you're selling to the U.S. market and you're producing in the U.S. market, you're not going to have a tariff, so it's not an issue for you. The other thing that perhaps we didn't make clear, because we're trying to condense a lot of material, all of this applies to only sole source drugs, except Generous, which applies to multi-source brands as well, which sort of undercuts generics and Medicaid, but yeah, so does everything else. But
Thank you. Thank you. Now a question that I think it's for Philippe. Philippe, what will happen in Europe if manufacturers don't want to sell or license their innovative products there? What do you think?
As I mentioned during this short presentation, actually for the moment, we encourage, also we as investors, we encourage the biotechs to consider and to focus initially on the US market, because that's where the prices are high, and that will pay back for the R&D investment. So we orient and guide the biotechs towards the US, even especially the European biotechs. Now, if the risk, and that's why it will require a lot of education, because we understand from this webinar that the situation is more complex and certainly more sophisticated than we thought. But the risk is that people don't consider anymore the lower income countries, middle income countries, and may even sacrifice some of the European countries that could be a reference to the US price. So that's the main risks. So hopefully, I think as we are getting more and more educated, and hopefully as we will educate more the investment community and the biotech community, we should put that in perspective. But that's the risk. So and it's not bad that we rebalance a little bit the development without only the focus to the US. But that will require some courage as well at some point.
Thank you. There's another question that I think I will answer. It says, to what extent do MFN clauses conflict with proposed EU legislation that could require pharmaceutical companies to launch medicines across all EU member states within a set time frame, or risk losing intellectual property rights? This is the European package, okay? It's a new legislation. And how might this affect pricing, access, and incentives for innovation? It's also related to another question that we got on European payers are willing to increase prices, yes? So really, I believe that it's a very interesting question, because we have two legislations really competing against each other. One wants to raise prices in Europe, and the other one, it's saying if you want to have longer intellectual property, you have to launch in all Europe. Knowing what we have seen about external reference pricing, is going to affect a lot, or I see that it can affect a lot the incentives for innovation. At the moment, the incentives are not there. No pricing, plus the obligation to launch in, or not obligation, but if you want more intellectual property rights obligation, to launch in the EU 26. So really, I think European policymakers will need to decide, I will say it as a whole, what they want to do, because for the time being, policymakers or payers don't want to raise prices. We follow another completely different process. We follow HTA process, comparative effectiveness. It's a process really, really different than the one in the USA that is more price driven. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on this sense. We have another very interesting question, okay, more for Deborah and Anna. That is, if the models were to be implemented, do you have recommendations for how CMMI should handle prices tied to patient outcomes, for example, in cell and gene therapies?
I personally think that cell and gene therapies are unique enough that if they do mitigate to the outpatient setting, they should probably be exempt, because they're fairly fragile as they are now, right?
I don't think they're included right now. If I have to double check, Deborah, but I think there's you know, the globe model is restricted to certain products. I will also say there's a very, very big difference between, you know, what a cell therapy is versus what a gene therapy is. So, you know, if you includes CAR therapy as well as, you know, other things. But at the end of the day, I think it's probably going to be carved out. If I'll have to double check, but I don't think it's included in the groupings.
Right now, they're not.
Can I ask a question myself and make a comment maybe on that? Because it seems to me that if cell and gene therapy are not included, it seems that we recognize somehow the particular innovative level of some technologies. So isn't there an avenue, or doesn't that open the door to considering innovation and making some difference based on the level of innovation at some point in the future.
Deborah, do you want to start or?
No, well, you and I kind of have different opinions about HTAs and value-based pricing. Although I actually do believe in warranties and value-based pricing, I certainly wish right now it's a little handicapped because they included the insurers that handle the warranty payments in best price, so it kind of nipped it in the bud. But it's just another issue. Go ahead, Anna. Well, you give your spin on it.
So I want to differentiate here between this notion of like, is it valuing innovation, and then like the value-based price are two different things. So with the cell and gene therapies, I think there's another component to it, which is, you know, and one of the things that we struggled with in developing the legislation for Medicare negotiation is the cost basis for different products is not the same. And when you start to dial on, you know, pricing, there is a risk when you're making assumptions about, let's say, the way that a small molecule drug is, you know, once it's in a steady state, you know, we know where the costs generally are. We can sort of make informed assumptions. You can't translate those assumptions directly to for example, a fractionated blood product. We don't know as much about, or at least we at the time didn't know as much about the economics there. So there are areas where, as a policymaker, you might say, okay, hold on, I don't know enough to know that to feel confident that it wouldn't disrupt the underlying economics in a way that, you know, is based on assumptions that aren't appropriate. So there is some of that. Separately, with regards to HTA, you know, it's interesting because these countries do use HTA that are in the MFN bucket. We don't. And, you know, warranty payments in outcomes-based contracts solve for a different issue, which is not the value of the product, but the uncertainty associated with achieving the outcome. So, you know, you can still put a value on the outcome and say, okay, we didn't achieve it and claw money back. What we don't do is say we have an expected value of the outcome to begin with.
I'll just point of clarification. I did double check. In cell and gene therapy, CMS is proposing to considering excluding them. But of course, they're kind of de facto excluded them right now because they're still in the inpatient setting. But we all know they want to move them to the outpatient setting. So, you know, there is that sort of tension. I happen to agree with Anna about the fractionated plasma products, the IVIGs of the world, because they're kind of how would you say it? They're a constrained supply, and they have a very variable supply and demand market. So they probably, in that way, are unique enough that, like in the IRA, they should be carved out.
Yeah, again, I think the challenge isn't that we shouldn't be having the conversation about those products and we shouldn't be thinking about what we pay for them. I think the challenge is in whether or not the assumptions made for a different class of product is appropriate for that one. I think that's one of the things that's really difficult for policymakers to understand in this environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question that the audience has posed is, will the proposal move to Senate and will it be approved? Or you think it will be stopped at some point, or maybe Garden Glove will be axed?
There's
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Anna. You're more of a Senate person than I.
So I think with, you know, it's if you're asking whether it gets codified, that's one thing. But these do have the ability to go forward without further legislative action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Roz said, and he's met with the congressional leaders several times. He said the reason why they're asking for it to be codified is because it's true that what happens in a CMMI model is it can, if it saves money, and this will save money by definition, it can move into permanent status. That's why a lot of people think that there's some underlying sort of constitutional issues, which is you're modifying laws without Congress being involved. Setting that aside, that's what they say they don't want if another president to come in and change the program, because that's why they want it in legislation. I believe there's an advantages for having it in legislation. But let's face it, now with those big rules out there with a very explicit programs, you know, the kind of bunny's out of the box.
Mhm.
It is a
Okay,
bunny.
and we have some questions that are very detailed. Let's see if I, do you know what the specifics are as to the differences between the streamlined and limited submission of globe and guard method 2?
Streamlined submitted. I'll have to look back at it. I believe it was an option that CMS was considering. So we'll, as you mentioned, one of the things we'll do with questions that we don't get to today, that we'll send
Yeah,
them out a list of
exactly. Yes, yes, we can send, when we send to all the audience our video, we can send the questions answered, okay? Can you explain what the add-on percentage amount for globe guard, which will equate to around 6% for both method 1 and 2 is, and for what reason is it applied?
Oh, well,
It's also very detailed.
It's, again, you know, these models borrow from what drug pricing is now. And under the statute, there is a 6% add-on for medical benefit drugs that really has almost no clearly defined legislative process. But it does have no legislative reason, excuse me. But CMS does propose to carry that on, and for what reason? I assume they thought that the physicians would object to it less because there's still an add-on, but it kind of doesn't make any sense because it's a rebate. So you got me.
I think it keeps physicians whole, right? So it doesn't alter what they see at the, and you know, like this is notably something that has been a game stopper for previous CMMI model that was meant to alter Part B reimbursement to physicians. So I think
they're not paid. They're not paid under MFN, so it sort of doesn't make any sense. It just adds that to a fudge factor, and it may be one of the many reasons. By the time you add in all the fudge factors, why that MFN price is about 71% of ASP. And you know, I don't know. It kind of technically, sort of like, you know, PPP that's over one, to me it doesn't make any sense, but I'm willing to argue with anyone the opposite.
there's a lot of stuff that happens between the lines, I think, that we are not privy to. So there's probably a very good reason why they're doing it, but it's not necessarily clear, right? That there's a difference between also the like adjustment factors that they describe, the 1.02 and 1.04% or 5%, I think it is, for the two different models, and then the 6% markup that is buy and bill. Those are distinct.
Good. Another question. Is there any further risk beyond MFN, such as PBM Transparency Act?
Further risk.
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, these are rebates. So in the retail, in the retail pharmacy, let's just walk slowly through it. These are rebates that are in the retail pharmacy. If, for example, the PBMs collect lower amount of rebates, then the MFN rebate goes up the way they said. However, I don't really see it affecting PBMs directly in that particular way. I think it affects them more on the fees side, frankly, that they'd be less willing to do bona fide service fees. And in that way, the legislation, which is very specific, I think, on fair market value, does play in a way, I guess, with fees about whether it's a bona fide service fee and that's excluded, or is it included? I'm sorry. Point of order, I'm gonna have to check to see whether, do you remember, Anna, whether bona fide service fees are subtracted from purpose of the rebate?
You don't know.
Anyway, yeah. I'll go back and order it and just focus on that bona fide service fee treatment. I didn't want to get into it in this presentation because it's so complicated. But I think that the fair market value is what sort of plays in there and probably deserves a longer explanation.
I do think it's really important to note. Sorry. No, I think it's important to note that there has been, a fair amount of critique of these of the sort of transparency laws that suggest that if anything, it reduces PBM's incentives to negotiate more aggressively on lower net prices, and so it's going to be out to see whether or not there's an upward or downward or sort of neutral effect on net pricing as we go. It's going to be, we have seen very strange dynamics with bona fide service fees in Part B, which makes me a little bit reluctant to say that this will or won't affect true net price, but what the net price looks like on paper will look different, right? So I think that's, and by the way, that's an important accounting point that we hadn't talked about for MFN, which is that, by providing net sales data, right, as part of the input for the method 2 or for the sort of that second like net price information, it's going to put pressure on movement to sort of get any net price concessions out of, so usually you do, you take that out of the top line revenue and you say, okay, net revenues were this amount. To the extent that you can no longer do that, right? You might, or you prefer not to do that to keep your revenues looking higher. They'll, I think, look for pharma companies to start to try to book net price concessions below that income line, right? So it becomes, and by the way, this is something that happens with bona fide service fees. Very often they don't come out of that top line, they stay in the top line, and then they come out as operational costs, which looks very different. So that affects the way that net sales get booked, and that could affect the way that companies start to operate in other countries to sort of try to make their net revenues look higher.
Yeah. And as a general comment that I want to add to the question around on the additional risks, I would just remember that remind everybody that investors don't like uncertainty, they don't like unpredictable environments, and they don't like complexity. So all of that can definitely impact the present environment, and the present environment on investment in the biotech level is not good already because of the economical situation. So if you add unpredictable situations on the pricing or other matters, it definitely doesn't help.
Yeah, and I think I agree with both of you. First of all, and this tremendously complex regulation, and in order to really understand it, you really have to be very comfortable and know all the drug pricing rules. And I think Anna's point is very well taken, especially about the delinking in the private sector, because if the PBMs have less of an incentive, and I believe in economic agency as anyone who ever studied economics believes, there's less of an incentive for rebates. And so that will coincide with the fact that manufacturers would be less interested in offering them. So that's not good for private sector costs.
Okay, so I have many more questions. So if you want, we can do like a Q&A to send to the audience later, because we have many interesting questions, but we are towards at the end of the webinar. I want to thank Deborah, Anna, Philippe, your presence and your dedication to prepare the presentation. We have put many hours into it. Also to all the people that to all the audience that took their time to listen to us, to ask questions. We really appreciate it. And you will hear from us, you will receive our final, they will receive an email with the webinar, the presentation that we have prepared, and the Q&A in the next few days. Give us some days to wrap it all up. Okay, so thank you very much, and feel free to contact us through LinkedIn or by email to if you have further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.